evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. The Reserve Bank is warning of further rate rises because of homegrown inflation. This after the Prime Minister has long insisted overseas factors were keeping inflation high. This is a big story and Ross Greenwood's analysis is coming up. Today, hundreds of school students walked out of class to protest against Israel. The organisers behind this event aren't even high schoolers themselves. A full report coming up in a moment. And the Australian media has been duped by a woman who claimed to be an impartial United Nations rapporteur, but in actual fact, she was in Australia on a trip funded by the Palestinian lobby. Israeli politician Sharon Haskell will join me a bit later. But first tonight, the deal to release hostages has been delayed 24 hours, while naive schoolchildren skipped school to protest against Israel today. A lot of news tonight. Let's get stuck into it, starting with the hostages. The first of the 50 Israeli hostages, women and children, was supposed to be finally coming home just hours from now. Instead, their release has been delayed until Friday, with Hamas yet to sign the agreement. We warned last night that Hamas would try to delay this deal for as long as possible to extend the lull in fighting. For mothers and fathers separated from their children who are still in the arms of terrorists, every minute apart counts. Every lost moment is precious. For this mother, Hadass, it's an anxious wait as both her children, aged 12 and 16, and her husband are being held hostage.
I know that without this family, these children and father, without them, I lost my life.
The families have no idea whether their loved ones will be chosen by Hamas for release. Each day, 12 people released in exchange for a ceasefire and a total of 150 Palestinian prisoners, criminals. Israeli soldiers, who'll be the first point of contact for the 30 children and 20 women, have been given a manual on how to deal with the littlest of the kids. They've been told not to pick the children up without asking, to give them agency because they'll likely be so deeply traumatised. They've been told that if the child asks where their mum or dad is, the soldiers have been told not to answer them, in some cases because these children won't have parents to come home to. They'll be returning to a very different world to the happy one that they left. It's truly heartbreaking. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the public today for the first time since his cabinet agreed to this hostage deal. He said he's told Mossad to target the heads of Hamas wherever they are in the world. And the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, added that Hamas leaders are living on borrowed time. Netanyahu says the decision to make a hostage deal was not an easy one.
Often find myself in a position in which I need to make very difficult decisions between a hard choice and an even harder one. And that is the case with the release of the hostages. The effort to bring them all back home continues constantly. And at this point in time, we can achieve the release of babies and children, mothers and women.
Today, on day 48 of this war, Netanyahu had earlier spoken to President Joe Biden to thank him for helping negotiate the hostage deal. But in the conversation, the US president also forcefully warned Israel against relocating Palestinians or redrawing the Gaza boundaries. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said it is inevitable that Hamas will benefit from this pause in fighting, but that Israel had no choice but to take the deal.
They can move their forces, they can move their headquarters into another place without us possibly knowing it, but this is the only available deal, and there was no way that they couldn't take it.
Back home, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong have been under pressure today over their vetting process for 860 Palestinians in Gaza who've been granted visas since the October 7 terror attacks. We brought you the news last night that between October 7 and November 20th, nearly 900 Palestinians have been granted visas to come to Australia, even though they're not Australian citizens. The opposition says there's no way detailed and rigorous security checks could have been done on 860 Palestinians in Gaza in a war zone in such a rushed time frame.
There needs to be rigorous scrutiny of the granting of the visas to these people, in particular to make sure that all of the usual security checks and processes were followed and that no corners were cut and nothing was rushed in the granting of these visas. Because 860 visas in a 6-week period in a conflict zone in which the Australian government has no presence on the ground is a very large number of visas in a very short period of time. And I am looking for reassurance from the government that no corners have been cut in granting of those visas.
Can someone just lie?
Yes, they can, Pete, and it is not uncommon for that to happen. People who are connected to terrorist organisations, who have committed crimes, obviously don't have a motivation to disclose that in the process. And so that's why our intelligence and security agencies, including ASIO, have quite robust approaches in how they test the propositions put forward and the information provided. They don't just accept it at face value, but they need time to do that. Duncan Lewis, the former Director General of ASIO, testified before a Senate committee in 2019 when he said that, in cases like these, it can typically take months to do that level of checking, to have that level of assurance. And obviously we haven't had months to do that for these cases, and it's a very large number. So I want to make sure that the Department of Home Affairs, that ASIO, that our agencies haven't been pressed, haven't been pushed to rush these through.
So as you heard there, James Paterson, the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, says that the former boss of ASIO said that these type of security checks usually take months, not days or weeks, months. Well, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, looked very uncomfortable when dealing with these questions today.
How do you ensure these people are aligned to Australian values and not anti-Semitic?
Well, these are not permanent visas. These are temporary visas. There are the same security checks that are in place for people, for Australians, that have been in place, this regime, for a long period of time.
And Foreign Minister Penny Wong just kept repeating the same line that the usual checks have been put in place. But she failed to explain how these checks were conducted when Australia has no presence on the ground in Gaza. How could they have been finished so quickly?
How have a few short weeks been enough time, though, to do proper security checks? Because as James Paterson said on our program last hour, that Dennis Richardson said this could take months, not weeks.
We take the advice of agencies and the advice I have been given is that all appropriate security checks, character checks and identity checks have been undertaken.
How can you be certain, though, that these people aren't linked with or sympathetic to Hamas?
Because we have undertaken, the government and its agencies are undertaking appropriate security checks.
So again, she did multiple interviews this morning, but in not one interview has Penny Wong or Albanese or any other minister been able to explain how the security checks were conducted with 860 Palestinians in Gaza when Australia has no diplomatic presence on the ground. Now, I put questions into ASIO and Home Affairs today to ask them about what process they took and if they can guarantee Australians that they're not bringing into the country Hamas sympathisers. Home Affairs responded to say, if a visa applicant is assessed as posing a risk to the health, safety or good order of the Australian community, their visa may be considered for refusal, and all visitors to Australia must meet the character requirements before granting a visa, regardless of country of origin. We asked Home Affairs questions that included, have you had adequate time to do the proper checks for these 860 people? How have you been able to interview them when Australia has no access to Gaza? Are you assured that they have no links to terror organisations? And can you guarantee the public that none of the 860 temporary visa holders have anti-Semitic attitudes that would further erode our social cohesion? So as you can see, Home Affairs did not answer any of our questions, which are firmly in the public interest. And ASIO responded to say that they can't speak to the specifics of the process. They just contribute to the Department of Home Affairs process as required. We have every reason to be deeply concerned about this. This is a government that has shown itself to be weak on national security, that has let murderers, rapists, child sex offenders loose into the community without any monitoring or proper protections. They didn't have a plan in place. So how can we check? How can we be sure that the checks have been done in this instance? The last thing we need is to potentially put our children and our community further at risk from anyone who's been at the very front line of this war. As I said last night, while many Palestinian civilians are innocent victims of Hamas, others agree with the hatred and have been pictured celebrating terror attacks against Jewish people. We need to be reassured that Australia is not providing safe passage for Hamas terrorists or sympathisers. And again, these 860 people are not Australian citizens. This at a time when social cohesion is already at breaking point, anti-Semitism now an epidemic. And it looks like anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism is going to be infiltrating our classrooms now too. Hundreds of students gathered at a rally in Melbourne today. They took to the streets to protest against Israel.
This attack was not unprecedented, as Israel has been occupying Palestine for over 70 years. Australian state genocided Indigenous communities. The Indigenous and Palestinian struggle goes hand in hand.
People frame this as a humanitarian crisis. It simply isn't true. This is murder in cold blood. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
The protesters, school students, blocked off major roads. As you heard, they chanted "From the river to the sea," a clear anti-Semitic slogan calling for the annihilation of Israel, of the Jewish homeland. There were also Marxism signs, and a Greens politician took part. Why would anyone want to divide school students like this? Why would anyone be looking to bring anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel into the classroom, where Jewish students and supporters of Israel will surely now be targeted and bullied? It's unconscionable that organisers have encouraged this protest, that school students are going to go back to school tomorrow and Jewish students will feel even more unsafe. Anti-Defamation Commission Chair Davir Abramovich said, "This is clearly an exploitation of students."
It's clear that all bets are off, and these dirty and ugly tactics of weaponizing and exploiting children to promote a divisive and dangerous agenda cannot become the new normal in our nation.
And the group who organised the rally, they're called School Students for Palestine, issued 3 demands. They want to end the war on Gaza immediately. Note their language, end the war on Gaza. Well, actually, this was a war on Israel, a war that Israel never wanted, never asked for. They want Israel out of Gaza and the West Bank. They want to end military aid and support from Australia to Israel. I mean, and that's the other thing about these students. They're all so ill-informed, they don't know what they're talking about. The state government and the opposition in Victoria asked students to stay in school, but clearly a polite request from politicians was never going to work. The leaders needed to be stronger about this from the very start, to actually shut down a protest during school hours, because it does create problems among our youth. It risks radicalising the young generation of Australians and puts Jewish children at even higher risk of attack. The Victorian government clearly didn't show enough leadership on this. Premier Jacinta Allen was slow to come out and condemn it and tell students firmly to stay in class. Watching the vision of the hundreds and hundreds of students who were there, it's very sad to see that these are the attitudes that are held by young Australians. And this comes as Bill Shorten's office was vandalised overnight for his support of Israel. And it follows pro-Palestinian protesters targeting Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister's office, also Chris Minns, the Premier in New South Wales. Their tactics are deplorable. And now they're grooming a new generation to hate Jews. These protests risk indoctrinating children to hate Israel in a similar fashion to how Hamas terrorists brainwash Palestinian youths to believe Jews are the enemy. Now, it was only last month that Michelle Bullock, the new RBA Governor, initially said the inflation outbreak had been mostly due to international factors and geopolitical shocks like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Middle East. But she has now changed her tune and her message in a major way. Last night, the Governor of the Reserve Bank said the inflation problem is increasingly homegrown, warning there are more rate rises on the table.
The remaining inflation challenge we're dealing with is increasingly homegrown and demand-driven. Interest rate rises are squeezing the finances of households with a mortgage. But while the board recognises that there is a wide diversity of experience, the bank's statutory objectives are economy-wide objectives, economy-wide outcomes. And our key tool, the interest rate, is, as we say, it's a blunt one.
Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood joins me now. Ross, this is highly problematic for the Prime Minister. He regularly says that inflation and rate rises are because of overseas factors. But Michelle Bullock really nipped that in the bud last night.
She did. She belled the cat on what we've been told for pretty much 18 months now by the government. And that is, hey, it's not our fault that there's inflation. It's all coming from overseas. It was quite clearly Russia's invasion on Ukraine that pushed up gas prices. Before then, it was clearly disruptions as a result of COVID that pushed up the price of freight. Now, all of these things added to inflation, there's no doubt. But they were kind of one-offs that ultimately would filter through the economy and would revert back to normal. But the government has persisted with that line, even when it became quite evident that the inflation was becoming homegrown. But the interesting part about Michelle Bullock is that she said, well, it's your hairdressers, it's when you go out, it's recreation, it's the dentist, which incurred the wrath of the dentists, I must admit today, who said she should apologise for that, claiming that their fees aren't going through the roof. But everybody recognises that much of this inflation is now out of our control. It's in our community, and it goes back to wage rises. It goes back to the fact that prices have gone up, so businesses have passed on those costs, and that's where inflation comes from. And when you're faced with that as a central banker, as Michelle Bullock is now our major central banker, well, your only option, as she says, is to continue to raise interest rates. So that was a very clear warning that though there was an interest rate rise last month or in the beginning of this month rather than November, that the fact of the matter is there may be more rate rises ahead unless this inflation does disappear and quickly.
Ross, I mean, we all remember the election campaign last year where Anthony Albanese put cost of living at centre stage of the campaign. He blamed Scott Morrison at that point. There was only one rate rise during the election campaign. We've had another 13 or 12 since then. But the point is, now it seems like monetary policy is doing all the heavy lifting. Fiscal policy, and you refer to wages growth there, seems to be at times working in a different direction.
Yes, but you can start to see the panic is coming inside the government as well. And take, for example, the words by the Treasurer only in the past week that we may have to defer some infrastructure projects because that infrastructure spending, in particular by state governments, not only have there been cost blowouts in most of the major projects around Australia, but also on top of that, it's creating more inflation. It's actually taking up more jobs, and the cost of materials are increased. I spoke with the boss of Australia's largest brickmaker, Lindsay Partridge, earlier this year. He said he's struggling to get the materials to build the new airport in Sydney because guess what? Others who are also helping to build the new airport in Sydney are also competing for those very same products. So this is something that is economy-wide. This is something that is within the government's control, and the government quite clearly has got to be very careful of its own spending, of the wage rises that come through in the future, of its industrial relations law changes. All of these things are themselves adding to inflation and therefore the pressure on Michelle Bullock to continue to raise interest rates.
Yeah, I thought it was good today or last night in that speech that she actually had the courage to talk about homegrown inflation and not feel that she had to stick to this government message of pretending that the reason inflation is looking like it's getting entrenched is purely because of overseas factors. Ross Greenwood, thank you so much for your time, and you can catch Ross every day at 4:30 right before my program. Now, after the break, Israeli politician Sharon will bring us the latest as we look ahead to hopefully starting to see the women and children hostages be freed tomorrow. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, the Australian media have been duped by a woman who claimed to be an impartial United Nations rapporteur, but in actual fact was here on a trip funded by the Palestinian lobby. You'll remember the publicity sweep that Francesca Albanese did on Australian television, where she only had angry words to say about Israel.
Israel cannot claim the right of self-defense against a threat that emanates from the territory it occupies. The thing is that there shouldn't have been a blockade for 16 years enabling Hamas to rule over Gaza as it has done against the will of the people. 56 years ago and 40 years ago, Hamas was not there and Israel was building settlements, and they are illegal, both in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem.
Is Hamas using this hospital as a command center?
You need to ask Israel to provide the proof that it is using it. Because look, we have gone through 5 major wars before this one, and Israel has attacked hospitals and ambulances claiming that they were being used by Hamas for military purposes, and most of these cases, the allegations proved false. I'm just saying, precedents.
Oh, propaganda. And when she was on Sky News, Pete Stefanovic did a tough interview with her and put her through her paces. But Francesca Albanese's bias was then further exposed when the project host, Waleed Ali, asked her this very important question. What would be the right response from Israel to the terror attacks on October 7? Well, her answer? 0 response from Israel. Nothing. Have a look.
In your view, what would the correct response have looked like?
The response was to be given in terms of law enforcement, because Gaza is occupied and it's under belligerent occupation. So Israel has powers to enforce the law and to pursue all security measures that are deemed necessary, considering that this is occupied territory. It could have relied on the United Nations to demilitarize Hamas if this was the target.
So, no, Israel shouldn't have responded to the worst terror attacks, the worst loss of life for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Oh, just send in the UN to take weapons off Hamas. What a farcical response. The Red Cross haven't even been able to visit the Israeli hostages, as if the UN could have taken weapons off Hamas. Now, if that interview with the project and all of her public commentary didn't expose her claims of independence as fraudulent, well, what I'm about to tell you certainly does. Well, first, the Executive Director of United Nations Watch, Hillel Neuer, came on this program on Tuesday evening, and he showed us how Francesca pretends to be neutral, but actually has a long history of dangerous remarks against Israel.
Neither her position nor her own background have anything to do with impartiality. Her mandate is only to investigate Israel, and the reason they picked her is because she is extremely biased. This is someone who, in 2014, wrote on Facebook that, quote, America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. This is someone who a year ago, in November 2022, spoke to a Hamas conference of terrorists, and she said, quote, you have a right to resist. This is someone who has regularly compared the situation of Palestinians to the Nazi Holocaust. So she is the last thing that has anything to do with impartiality, neutrality, objectivity, and she should be exposed.
Well, Hillel Neuer, as I said, from United Nations Watch, he's now revealed that Albanese's trip to Australia was sponsored by Palestinian lobby groups. And these groups, the Australian Friends of Palestine Association, the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, as well as the Free Palestine Melbourne and Palestinian Christians in Australia groups. This is in breach of the United Nations' own code of conduct that bars experts from taking any gift, favour or remuneration. Article 3 of the Code of Conduct states that UN figures should be, and I quote, free from any kind of extraneous influence, either direct or indirect, and they may not seek or accept any favour, gift or remuneration from any non-governmental source for activities carried out in pursuit of his or her mandate. Well, United Nations Watch has now filed papers with the UN chief calling for Francesca Albanese's removal from her position as UN Special Rapporteur. And she should immediately be removed. And she should have made it clear in every single one of those media appearances, on the ABC's Q&A, at the National Press Club, on the project, that her trip was sponsored by Palestinian lobby groups. Jewish groups had sent a letter to the ABC demanding that Francesca Albanese not be given a platform on Q&A because of all of the disgraceful and anti-Semitic views she's expressed in the past. Well, the ABC ignored the demand and had her on the show anyway. Now it seems the public broadcaster owes Australian viewers and the Jewish community an apology. They presented someone as independent when in fact she was here being paid to be in Australia to sprout hateful views against Israel and Jews. To discuss, joining me now, commentator Jason Morrison and former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop. Welcome to you both. Bronwyn, what's your reaction to this? It looks like a fraud, if not a clear conflict of interest.
I'm not surprised. I bothered to take a look. Since the inception of the United Nations Human Rights Council, there have been 45 motions condemning Israel. The United Nations clearly just is against Israel again and again and again, and she's part of that. But it does make you ask this question. The sheer brutality of what was done on the 7th of October, which people wouldn't publish because of how it would affront. I think people need to know that brutality because what it was designed to do, perhaps, was to make Israel retaliate with force and say we're going to get rid of Hamas. In the meantime, there's been a work right across the Palestinian support groups to drum up anti-Semitism or Jew hatred right across the world. Plus the United Nations send her out here to try and give it a bit of respectability and don't identify her as being part of that Palestinian pan movement. And when I see those children in the streets...
Yes, today in Melbourne.
I just go back to the tactics that socialists around the world always use, and it's in their DNA. They all have a youth movement. And the reason is that they're easier to persuade. There's little resistance because the knowledge base isn't there. And so it's not surprising to me that those people who are activists within the education system and in places of power can use it to drum up those kids to be sprouting things, many of which I would think some of them didn't even know the meaning of.
Oh, I mean, a lot of what they were saying today at those school protests in Melbourne. And Jason, there were hundreds of school students there. They're meant to be in class. Instead, they're being indoctrinated to hate Israel and Jews.
And they'll be back tomorrow. There's one organised in Sydney, and the propaganda, I'll call it that, that's being passed around on social media, it's vile stuff, and it's kids saying it. I mean, these aren't university idiots, your classic dickheads from university out saying it. These are children in high schools that are now repeating this stuff. But, back a little step on this UN lady.
Francesca Albanese.
Doesn't it say so much about the Australian media? Did anyone for a moment stop and think, hang on, there's a crisis in the Middle East right now, and she's out here doing the press club in Australia, right in the middle of all of this, that she thought this where she should be right now is here, and no one stopped to say, hey, who's paying for you? Or did anyone for a minute, and this is an insight into the Australian media, if you put the letters UN in front of anyone's name or professor in front of someone's name, there's sort of this sort of suggestion, particularly in the ABC, that they're beautifully white and partial, clean. They're not affected by bias or prejudice. That's her. It was a giveaway from the moment she opened a trap that she was out here on a propaganda tour. And nobody stopped. And how many times did she pop up on the ABC? In your little montage, I think twice. Then there's ABC Radio that would have had a few cracks at her, and she would have been reported repeatedly in the news. And no one, all these journalists that are apparently there to look into the depth of all of these things, no one stopped for a second to ask the question. And those organisations that sponsored her, don't forget that many of those organisations are directly or indirectly supported by government agencies, given funding through multicultural grants, either directly or indirectly. So, you know, the taxpayer is kicking in on all of this.
Yeah.
It is disgraceful, and good on you and UN Watch for calling it out, and to the Australian media that kind of missed it. You know, I don't know where you're looking.
Yeah, no, Hillel Newer does an absolutely brilliant job over there in Geneva. We have him on the show often. Look, to go to a different topic, this immigration scandal, the Daily Telegraph, a big exclusive today, reports that the Labor government actually doesn't know how many detainees are wearing ankle bracelets. They're unable to confirm. And, you know, Bronwyn, this has, in a way, really shocked the Labor government. They didn't expect this was going to blow up into a scandal after the High Court decision. And it did take kind of a few days for the opposition hammering them with questions. First, for them to introduce legislation that meant the criminals could have ankle bracelets, but now no one seems to be monitoring who's wearing them and who's not.
Look, I've never seen such a mess as a government, and I've seen quite a few. This one takes the cake. It's got ministers who are not on top of their portfolios. It's got a mantra that says, it's not our fault, it's all their fault. They have not taken responsibility for anything. Even the minister herself, when she was asked...
Claire
O'Neill, when she was asked about this question of the bracelets, oh, well, that's all Mr Giles' fault. You know, it's his responsibility. She has not been responsible to take responsibility for anything. So it's time she resigned or was sacked, one or the other, and put in someone with some knowledge. There was a warning back in June when Justice Gleeson, who's the daughter of the former Chief Justice Gleeson, who was one of the people who voted 20 years ago that it was unconstitutional, gave a warning and said, this isn't looking good. At that moment, they should have twigged. From that moment, there should have been a whole series of alternatives put in place so that when that judgment came down, if it was adverse, then they immediately had a strategy and legislation ready to go.
To protect the community.
Yes. But none of that's done because there is no structure to the government.
Yeah.
It was all the voice. And once he got the voice up, the next thing was, oh, it worked. We put up a proposition, didn't give them any facts, so we whizzed it through. Next we'll do the Republic, and then my job's done. I'm terrific in history. Well, that blew up, didn't it?
You know, you watch this and you think it's actually too ridiculous to be accidental. The incompetence is too ridiculous to be accidental. The number one reason federal government exists is for the protection of the people. And on this, they have failed. And you look and you say, well, the minister responsible, I mean, she's just a bunny in the headlights on this. You look, I mean, remember where she was with Donald Trump Jr.? Yeah, she's quick on Twitter saying childish things.
Exactly.
She still thinks she's playing a game. I'm sorry, madam, this is the real game. This is the real deal here. And you're letting Australians down and you're leaving people who should be protected by the government. That's your job. You're leaving them exposed.
Jason, just very quickly, this is the biggest issue that's probably cut through to the Australian public. What do you think?
Well, it just says they don't care. They don't, and I keep going to this. The number one reason we have Commonwealth government, because we've got so many other levels of government in this country, the number one reason we have is protection of the people. And they fail on that front, and that's an indicator that they don't give a rat's. And you know, if that's how you're going to be judged for your time in government, you can have all the selfies you want all around the world with every leader, but if you can't guarantee the Australian people that when it comes to the crunch that you'll be there to protect them, you've failed, and they are failing.
Well, the words in the Constitution are that they should govern for the peace, welfare and good government for the people of Australia. That's what they're required to do. And the Constitution's very clear on that, doesn't need interpretation at all.
Bronwyn Bishop, Jason Morrison, thank you both so much for your time today. Now, coming up, Israeli politician Sharon Haskell will bring us the latest on this Israel-Hamas ceasefire and hostage release. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, let's return to the biggest news this week, that Israel and Hamas reached a deal for a 4-day ceasefire for the release of 50 hostages from Gaza, and it would mean 150 Palestinian criminals would also be released from Israeli jails. Joining me now, Member of Israeli Parliament, or Knesset, Sharon Haskell. Sharon, thank you. Welcome back to the program. Look, we were meant to start seeing the release of 12 hostages, women and children, from tonight, just an hour away. Why has this been delayed do you think Hamas is playing games here?
Look, it's very difficult to say whether they're playing game, but they are trying to reach a little bit more in that agreement, and they're trying to bargain more. The deal is not closed and is not completely signed now. If there are going to be major changes, this will have to be voted again in the cabinet, and there will have to be another 24 hours to be given to the public to appeal on it. So I guess that they can't make any major changes because that's going to postpone it already to next week. From what we've told, that it will probably be closed within a few hours. And then on Friday, they are going to be releasing the first few, hopefully.
Look, the reaction from many people I speak to and many Jews around the world are, why is it 3-1? Why 150 Palestinians for one Jewish people? Why are more Palestinians, especially criminals, whereas these are innocent Israelis? Why 3-1? Why couldn't Israel reach a deal where it was 1-1?
It's a good question, Sharri. And, time after time, we have paid immense prices to keep our people safe time after time. I mean, look on the Gilad Shalit deal when we tried to bring him home, and that cost us a great amount of life after the releasing of thousands of terrorists with blood on their hands, when the first thing they did back is going back into those activities and have murdered more civilians. And we've learned that lesson, and that's why we couldn't agree to the deals that were brought before. I can't tell you that we're happy with this deal. Obviously, we are paying a price, and we understand what will happen with those people who are released, because time after time, those people who've been radicalized are not being rehabilitated. I mean, they don't remorse their actions. They don't feel the guilt. On the contrary, they're proud of it. Their community sees them as heroes. They're being paid for it, like 10 times more than the average salary. And so you can't be rehabilitated from being radicalized if you don't understand that you committed a crime, if you feel like you're a hero, if you're being praised and paid for it. But at the same time, this price is a price that we feel we need to pay for the release of our loved one, for the release of our families, of the children, of the women. It feels bitter on the other side because we do want all of them. We want also our husbands and our grandparents and our sons. And
exactly. Sharon, look, I want to ask you as well. I had some inside information that I'd love to ask you about, that there's been this mismatch between the number of hostages Israel believes are being held in Gaza and the number that Hamas say they have. So what I've been told is that indicates that some of the hostages might be held by other terrorist groups, or Hamas doesn't actually know where they are.
Yeah, so two things. One, we still have Israeli citizens who are being kept in Gaza from prior combats. And I speak about Oron Shaul and Hadar Goldin and Avera Mengistu. We are still waiting for them, and they know perfectly where they are. And the other thing is that after Hamas terrorists have invaded Israel and explode and cut down the fences, they actually called down not just more Hamas activists, but just a mob that came in and started robbing and abusing and the bodies and did a complete chaos, and most probably have taken hostages into Gaza as well. So they can't give us the full number, but what we are comforted in is that it has been promised that the Red Cross will enter and will visit all of our family members and our hostages. And I hope that in this way we'll be able to reach some information about them.
Yeah. Sharon, we've only got a minute before we're out of time, but just very quickly, the Australian government here has announced that we're going to be giving temporary visas to 860 Palestinians from Gaza. These are people who are not Australian citizens. The opposition here has expressed some security concerns about whether they might have links to a terror group or just anti-Semitic sentiment. Do you think those concerns are valid?
Look, I do think these concerns are valid, and it really depends on who you're bringing in. There was a research done in Denmark. There was about, I think it was a few thousand Palestinian refugee. And a few years later, they've done a research, and it showed that about, I think it was 62% of them had already a criminal record. I think that like more than 30% of their children had a criminal record. This is something that needs to be followed. It's when people have been radicalized and believe ideology in that Islam has to rule the world, that Sharia laws have to come to be the law of humans. This is a dangerous thing, and it doesn't matter where they are. There has been terrorist attack in Europe and in America. So I say it with a lot of careful. Of course, it has to be in-depth investigated and seen their background, and the people that are actually coming in probably need to be monitored as well. But at the same time, it's important to also point out the hypocrisy of the Arab world. They are demanding from Western countries to absorb and to take in Palestinian refugees when they won't take even a single one. Look,
good point. No, it's a very good point. I'm sorry, Sharon, we are completely out of time, but it's an excellent point, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the program. Thank you very, very much. Sharon Haskell, Israeli politician. After the break, the latest from the Bruce Lerman defamation case, and the Security Committee wants to ban Nazi symbols. Why doesn't the Albanese government agree? Stay tuned. Welcome back. Sky News reporter Kenny Heatley has the latest from inside the Bruce Lerman defamation case today.
That's right, Sharri. For the past 2 days, Bruce Lerman has been in the witness box in court answering questions about the night he and Brittany Higgins entered Parliament House after Friday night drinks in Canberra. But this afternoon, under tense cross-examination, Network 10's barrister Dr. Matt Collins pressed Bruce Lerman about a kick-on following a swearing-in ceremony for then Liberal Minister Linda Reynolds at a Canberra pub early March in 2019. Dr. Collins put it to Mr. Lerman. He said to two other staffers present that Miss Higgins was good-looking, which he denied. Dr. Matt Collins said, "You said to Miss Harmer in the presence of Mr. Watton, message her. That is, message her and see if she's free to come to the pub." Bruce Lerman responded, "I don't recall that happening." It was suggested to the court Mr. Lerman had snatched Brittany Higgins' phone off her to stop her ordering an Uber to leave the pub. And in this next exchange, Dr. Matt Collins says, "I suggest you refused to hand Ms. Higgins' phone back to her for a time, but eventually relented." And Bruce Lerman responded, "That did not happen." He told the court after separating from Brittany Higgins inside Parliament House, he went to his desk and spent 30 to 40 minutes annotating briefs for question time folders for then Defence Minister Linda Reynolds. The court heard once he'd finished, he ordered an Uber and left. And then this exchange. "Did you make any inquiries about the whereabouts of Miss Higgins before you left?" "I did not." "Why not?" "I wasn't even sure she was still there. I indicated as I entered as well that I would get what I need and head off. I thought that was sufficient." "Did you sexually assault Brittany Higgins in the office on that evening?" Bruce Lerman said, "Absolutely not." Bruce Lerman is suing Network 10 and TV presenter Lisa Wilkinson over the broadcast of an interview with Brittany Higgins on February 15, 2021. In its defence filed with the federal court, Network 10 said it would rely on defences of truth and qualified privilege. Sharri, Lisa Wilkinson, Brittany Higgins and then Chief of Staff to Linda Reynolds, Fiona Brown, are all expected to give evidence in this 4-week-long judge-only trial.
All right, Kenny Heatley, thank you for that. Now, Liberal National Party MP and former Speaker of the House, Andrew Wallace, joins me now. Andrew, look, we've been talking about the 860 temporary visas given to Palestinians and how quickly those temporary visas have been granted. But Labor Minister Ed Husic said today that those asking questions mustn't care about the Palestinians. What's your response to this?
Well, it's a pretty bizarre response, Sharri. And whilst I'm not suggesting, and I'm sure no one on my side of politics is suggesting that all Palestinians are bad people, I don't believe that for a second. But I had the opportunity to watch a 42-minute video last week with the Israeli ambassador of the slaughter of more than 100 people on the 7th of October. And I think what struck me the most out of that absolutely horrific video was watching people, the hostages that were taken back to Gaza, and seeing the sheer delight of civilians who were rejoicing in watching these hostages, these innocent civilians being beaten severely, some shot, some maimed, and the delight amongst the civilian population. Now, we need to be very careful about whoever we let into this country, but wherever there is such a hatred of one group, an important group, such as the Jewish community in this country, I think we need to be very, very careful. We need to be assured by this government that appropriate steps are being taken to do all the necessary background checks.
Well, Andrew, sorry to interrupt you, but we're not getting those answers from Penny Wong or Albanese today. They're just repeating the same line, that checks are being taken. ASIO Home Affairs didn't answer my questions properly today. So, you're on the Intelligence Committee. Are you in a position to actually get some answers here about how these checks have been done, given it's a war zone, given Australia has no presence in Gaza right now?
Well, I think you just have to look at how long it takes ordinarily to get a visa, a protection visa. And, if these things are being done in hours or days, then I would have my grave reservations as to whether they're being done appropriately and whether all of the necessary checks and balances are actually being done.
All right, look, just on another topic, your committee wanted to ban the public display of the swastika and other, Nazi salutes. The government, the Albanese government, has argued that they don't want the Nazi salute to be banned. Why is this?
Well, Sharri, the government members on the committee mounted a spurious argument that really this was a matter that was best left for the state and territory police, that there were some constitutional issues, both of which are just absolutely unjustifiable. There is no constitutional issue in relation to the banning of the Nazi salute, just as there is no constitutional issue in relation to the banning of the sale or display of Nazi memorabilia, that the Hakenkreuz or the double Sigrun. If it's good enough for the government to agree, and the Prime Minister just said yesterday that these symbols are bad, they should be banned. For the life of me, I cannot understand why they are not going that one step further, as recommended by the coalition.
Absolutely.
And banning the Nazi salute.
Yeah, it makes no sense at all. Andrew Wallace, thank you so much for joining me and for your important work. Now, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for watching this week. Let's pray that 24 hours from now, we start to see the release of those hostages. Here's Peter Cradley.